Welcome to Quantum Voyager Stories, where science fiction touches the soul and every story takes you somewhere you've never been, leaving something real behind. The storm didn't knock. It howled. Snow slashed sideways across the frozen skies of Altherra, pounding against the rugged exterior of Kaelen's remote cabin with unrelenting force. The wind screamed like a wild beast, worming through every crack, rattling the vents, icing over the solar panels, and making the wooden walls groan under the weight of its fury. Inside, the thermal core hummed faintly, the only steady sound in a world swallowed by chaos. The flickering fire cast dim orange light across rough stone walls, shadows shifting like ghosts. Kaelen sat hunched near the hearth, broad shoulders bowed, calloused hands cradling a lukewarm mug of tea he hadn't touched. He didn't drink it, rarely did. It wasn't about the tea. It was the act, the routine. Something to hold onto while silence did its slow, merciless work. On Altherra, silence wasn't peace. It was weight. Kaelen had come to the edge of known space for that silence. Chosen it. Begged for it. After the war, after what he'd seen and what he'd done, noise only meant screams. Gunfire. Collapsing bunkers. Final breaths. Silence was the only thing that didn't scream back. And yet, tonight, even silence pressed down heavier than usual. His eyes drifted to a battered military satchel hanging by the door. The strap was frayed, its insignia scorched and faded. He hadn't touched it in years, maybe longer, but something about the storm called to him. Slowly he stood, knelt, undid the latch and pulled out a photo, creased, worn and still sacred, for people frozen in time. 3 men and a woman in uniform, all smiling. Kaelen, the youngest, stood to the left. No scar on his cheek, holding a rifle like it was weightless. The others were gone now. Lost. Buried. One had died in his arms, bleeding out with his knees on Kaelen's lap. Kaelen closed his eyes, holding the photo like a relic. That had been the last time he believed in anything: brotherhood, mission, purpose. The storm outside howled louder, and beneath it something else. A knock. He went still. Another knock. Barely there. Then a soft thud, like a body slumping against the door. His body moved before his mind caught up. Years of habit, hardwired reflex. He threw on his thermal coat, grabbed the pistol from the wall, and moved toward the door with practiced caution. There were no neighbors here. No patrols. No wanderers. No one knocked unless they meant trouble. He unlocked the door, pushed against the wind, and opened it, and froze. 3 figures stood in the blizzard. A woman, tall, thin, trembling, stood in front. Her skin was pale and frostbitten blue, stretched tight across sharp cheekbones. Long white hair whipped behind her like torn silk, crusted with frost. Her golden eyes blinked against the snow. Clinging to her legs were 2 children, frail and quiet. Their skin matched hers, but they had tangled white hair and eyes far too large for their tiny faces. The older one, 6, maybe 7, tried to shield the younger with his small frame, though he clearly didn't have the strength left to do so. Kaelen didn't move. He'd seen war. This wasn't war. Then the woman spoke. Her voice was low and raw, as though every word scraped her throat. "I will warm your bed, human. My children need a father." Kaelen blinked, not at the words but at the tone. No seduction, no negotiation, just exhaustion, just desperation. The boy looked up, lips nearly blue. "We haven't eaten," he whispered. "Mama said someone kind would help." Kaelen looked down at the girl, barefoot, toes purple, breath shallow. She stared up at him, not afraid, just curious. "Do you have soup, mister?" she asked. "Mama said warmth comes from kind people." Kaelen tightened his grip on the doorframe. He wasn't a kind man. Not anymore. But even he had limits. He lowered the pistol. "Get inside," he said, voice rough, and stepped aside. The storm shrieked outside like a wounded beast, battering the reinforced walls of Kaelen's cabin. Wind tore at the edges of the door, probing for a weakness. But the structure held as it always had for 7 long years. Inside, the fire hissed low in the hearth, its glow casting restless shadows across the worn floorboards and the tools hanging on the walls. Kaelen sat hunched near the flames, sharpening a blade more out of habit than need. Silence had become his companion, wrapping around him like armor. Then came the knock. It wasn't loud, just a fragile series of taps, irregular, hesitant. The sound of someone barely hanging on. Kaelen froze. No one knocked on his door. Not here. Not on Altherra. Slowly, he rose, blade still in hand, muscles coiled. A dozen thoughts passed through his mind, chief among them. Ignore it. The storm would bury any trace. By morning, whatever it was would be gone. But the knock came again. Cautiously, he approached the door and slid aside the small viewing latch. What he saw made his breath catch. A woman stood there, her body wrapped in what was left of a torn thermal cloak. Snow and frost clung to her hair. Her eyes, though red from cold, held steady. Flanking her were two children, one no older than a toddler, the other perhaps 8, both huddled against her sides. The older boy tried to shield the smaller girl with his coat, his face pale and drawn. Kaelen didn't move. The woman met his eyes through the icy glass and raised a trembling hand to the window. No begging, no words, just quiet desperation. A mother on the edge, shielding her children from a world that had already taken too much. He hesitated. His breath hitched, the moment pressing harder than the storm itself. He didn't just see her, he saw someone else. Just for an instant, the snow blurred into memory, and there she was again. Lyra, his daughter, standing at a window, tiny hands tapping faintly on the glass of a room he never made it back to. Her face pale with fever, her eyes waiting for a goodbye that never came. He had been too late. And now, this? Strangers, children, a blizzard gnawing at them like it wanted to erase them from the map. He told himself it wasn't his problem. Altherra was littered with ghosts and fugitives. They'd bring trouble. He owed them nothing. But something in those eyes, hers, and the boys', cut through the years of silence he'd built around himself. They weren't pleading. They simply existed. Silent, still, but not surrendering. He could turn away, let the storm finish its work. Instead, he reached for the latch. The wind slammed against him the instant the door opened, flinging snow into the cabin like a living thing. The cold bit deep, but Kaelen ignored it and stepped aside. The woman paused just long enough to assess the danger, then ushered the children inside. He closed the door hard behind them, sealing out the chaos. The silence that followed was thick and jarring. The children stood motionless, too frozen to even shiver. The boy's lips were tinged blue. The girl blinked up at Kaelen, wide-eyed and silent. Without a word, he tossed more fuel on the fire, coaxing the flames back to life. Warmth began to crawl back into the room. He threw them a thick blanket. The woman caught it and wrapped her children tightly, kneeling beside them near the hearth. Only then did Kaelen speak. "How'd you find this place?" Her voice was raw. It was marked on an old survey map. "I didn't know if it was still here." He studied her. She looked half dead from exhaustion and cold. But beneath the weariness was resilience, a kind forged in hardship. He recognized it. He'd worn it once too. He brought them water, not out of kindness, but because dying of thirst after surviving a storm felt like a cruel cosmic joke. She nodded in silent thanks, giving the water to the children first. She didn't take a sip until both had finished. "Names?" he asked. "I'm Lyra," she said. "This is Corin." "And Nira." Kaelen said nothing. He turned away, breathing deep. The name Nira scraped something brittle inside him, but he shoved it down. "Don't touch anything. Don't break anything. You can stay until the storm lets up." Lyra met his eyes again, steady. "Thank you." That was all. The wind had quieted, but the air inside the cabin still felt colder than it should have. It wasn't the fire. Kaelen had kept it going, feeding it with precision. No, the cold was something else. It came from the way he moved, the way he watched. Always one step removed, always calculating. Even now, with the storm behind them and warmth slowly returning to the room, He remained a silhouette more than a presence. Present but unreachable. He sat at the edge of the hearth, repairing the same piece of gear he'd already fixed twice. His fingers worked with practiced calm, but his eyes flicked, constantly, to the woman and children who now occupied his once solitary space. Kaelen hadn't spoken since that brief exchange the night before. He hadn't needed to. He communicated in movements, in silences that had meaning only he seemed to understand. He noticed how Selira folded the blanket just so when the children no longer needed it, how she wiped down their cups after drinking, though no one had asked her to. She was careful not to touch anything she hadn't been given. That mattered to him, but it didn't mean he trusted her. Every gesture of kindness he extended, placing food on the table, sliding a fresh canister of water within reach, adding fuel to the fire, was done without eye contact, without acknowledgement. He didn't stay in the same room long once his task was complete. He lingered just long enough to see they weren't dead or dying, then retreated to another corner of the cabin where he could observe without being observed. There was a time in his life when he would have called this tactical awareness. Now it felt more like habit. The residue of war clung to him in quiet ways. The way he positioned himself near exits, how his ears tuned into every shift in weight on the floorboards, how he watched Selira's hands more than her face. Not because she'd done anything suspicious, but because anyone could be dangerous. She seemed to understand this, or at least she didn't press. Selira gave him space, choosing silence over small talk. When the children asked questions, she answered them softly, never louder than necessary. When Kaelen entered the room, she subtly guided them to quieter activities, drawing in the ash near the hearth, or sorting bits of scrap metal into neat piles. She didn't look at Kaelen expectantly, didn't ask for more than what was offered. It didn't escape him that this too required strength, the ability to remain present without intruding. And still, he couldn't let go of the part of his mind that ran calculations. How much food they'd consume. How quickly the stored heat would drain with extra bodies in the space. Whether the noise of children's laughter, rare as it was, would carry into the wild outside. Whether someone else might follow their tracks, even this late after the storm. Kaelen wasn't cruel. But kindness was a resource like rations or ammunition. You didn't waste it unless you were sure. And he wasn't sure. He noticed, too, how Selira's movements were precise, economical. That spoke of discipline, or hardship, or both. She moved like someone who had learned to carry grief without dropping it. He recognized that rhythm. He wore it himself. In the evenings, he pretended to sleep while the children settled under the blanket pile near the fire. He heard Nira murmur something in her sleep once, a soft whimper that faded as Selira pulled her close. The sound tugged at something deep, a chord that hadn't been played in years. But he didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at the low ceiling and let the fire crackle on. This wasn't a family. It was an arrangement, temporary, necessary. And yet, when the wind outside picked up again 2 nights later, Kaelen stood without thinking and reinforced the shutters. Twice. Then checked the backup heat lines just in case. Old instincts. That's all it was. At least, that's what he told himself. Kaelen never said the words, "Are you hungry?" or "Do you need help?" But somehow the help came anyway. On the second morning, before anyone else stirred, he placed a tin plate of warmed root mash and preserved protein on the edge of the table, just far enough from the fire to keep it warm, but not dry out. When Selira and the children awoke, the food was already waiting. He was nowhere in sight. No explanation. No instruction. Just silent offerings. By the time they finished eating, he had returned, tools in hand, acting as if nothing had changed. When the boy, Corin, tried to thank him, Kaelen gave only the faintest glance, like he'd barely heard. Then he picked up a wrench and disappeared into the back room. That became the rhythm. In the afternoons, while Selira cleaned or comforted the children, Kaelen moved through the cabin like a phantom, refilling the water tank, adjusting the vent seals, checking the structural integrity of the heating coils. He didn't speak. He didn't ask. But he noticed. When Corin limped slightly after tripping on a loose floorboard, Kaelen didn't comment. Hours later, A small medkit appeared on the table with a single antiseptic bandage left on top, subtle but deliberate. When Nira began coughing at night from the cold air draft, Kaelen reinforced the window seams near the sleeping area before sunrise, sealing them tighter without waking anyone. Even the fire, he tended it before they could. When the flames got too low, he'd add fuel quietly. When they got too high, he adjusted the vent. Salira watched all of this without interrupting. She never thanked him out loud again, not because she wasn't grateful, but because she understood. Words, to him, were walls. Actions were the only language he tolerated. He never sat with them, but he made sure there were extra blankets folded near the fire. He never touched the children. But when Nira's boots began to fall apart at the seams, a pair of salvaged thermal socks appeared near her sleeping mat the next evening. Not new but clean. Not gifted, but placed. Quietly. And when Corin returned from a trip outside to use the waste unit with hands numb from cold, Kaelen tossed him a pair of insulated gloves without a word. The boy stared, confused, and then looked to his mother. She gave only the smallest nod, as if to say, "Just take them. Don't ask." It wasn't kindness in the traditional sense. It was survival layered with memory, Kaelen giving what he wished someone had given his own child long ago. Every act of help carried the weight of something unspoken. He wasn't trying to make them feel welcome. He was trying to make sure they didn't die. And that, in its own way, was more honest than any promise of protection. One evening, as a cold front blew in and the winds began to rattle the outer supports again, Kaelen left a sealed ration pack on the shelf above where Salira kept their supplies. Not in plain view, he didn't want it noticed too easily. But she found it anyway. She said nothing, just tucked it away for when it would matter most. In the quiet hours that followed, while the children slept, she glanced toward Kaelen's shadowy figure near the far wall. He was bent over an old solar heater panel, pretending to tinker with its wiring. He wasn't watching her, but she knew he was listening, so she said nothing either. Just let the fire crackle. Let the silence settle. Let the balance hold. Salira understood the rules, even though they were never spoken aloud. From the moment she crossed the threshold of Kaelen's cabin, she had been walking a narrow line. A guest, not a resident. She didn't ask questions, didn't explore, didn't overstay her welcome in any corner of the room. There was something sacred about the silence in that space, like stepping into the center of a wound that had never fully closed. She never asked Kaelen about himself. Not out of fear, but out of respect. Whatever life he had before this cabin, it lived behind his eyes in flashes too sharp to share. She saw it when his hand hesitated over the fireplace controls, or when the sound of the wind made him flinch just slightly, as though recalling something not from this planet. So she stayed within the boundaries he allowed, if not with words, then with space. She kept her voice soft, her movements economical. When she cooked, she used only the ingredients Kaelen had left in easy reach. When she cleaned, she avoided his tools, even if they were scattered or dusty. When she rearranged the sleeping space for the children, she made sure it was compact, unobtrusive, and far from his usual resting spot. This wasn't submission. It was awareness, an unspoken agreement. Kaelen didn't demand these things, but Salira knew what it meant to share space with someone haunted. She'd once lived with someone like that, and maybe, in some ways, she still was someone like that. In the early mornings, while Kaelen was outside checking sensors or clearing snow from the perimeter, she swept the floor quietly with an old synthetic broom. The children slept nearby, bundled tight under the layered blankets. She didn't sing or hum, though melodies often danced at the edge of her throat. Even small joys felt like they had to be earned in this place. When Kaelen returned, she didn't greet him, just offered a nod, a glance of acknowledgement, and returned to her work. Sometimes he nodded back. Most times he simply moved past her, as though they were ghosts in the same house, drifting without collision. Still, she noticed the way he glanced at Corin when the boy practiced whittling with a dull blade Kaelen had left out, or how he adjusted the cabin's internal temperature by a single degree when Nira sneezed in her sleep. These weren't gestures of connection. They were calibrations, adjustments, and Selira never treated them as more than that. At night, when the children settled in, she kept herself awake a little longer, listening to the quiet. It wasn't peaceful, but it was safe, and that was rare. Sometimes she sat near the window and watched the lights flicker across the snowy hills. Sometimes she watched Kaelen, who would sit sharpening tools or maintaining the wiring behind the solar grid. Always busy, always silent. She never intruded on those moments, and he never offered entry. This strange dance, neither warmth nor coldness, became its own kind of rhythm. She didn't force conversation, didn't push gratitude. In a world where so much had been taken by force, she had learned that dignity came from knowing when to ask for nothing. It surprised her, though, how much that space seemed to comfort the children. They didn't fear Kaelen, though they kept their distance. Corin, especially, seemed to sense the rules as she did. He never touched Kaelen's things without permission, never ran through the room or raised his voice. Nira, younger and more impulsive, still had her moments, but even she seemed to intuit the silence around them. Like stepping into a cathedral of pain, they walked with soft feet. One night, while she tended to Nira's cough, Selira felt a slight shift, barely noticeable. Kaelen had left a small bowl of warm saline water on the stove, covered and untouched. She hadn't asked for it, hadn't needed to, but it was there. She didn't look at him, didn't thank him, just dipped a cloth into the steam and pressed it gently against her daughter's chest. She knew enough not to say anything. Silence, after all, was the only language that didn't threaten him, and so she spoke it fluently. It began with a drawing in the ash. Nira had taken a small stick and, with all the seriousness of an artist, began to trace shapes in the soot near the hearth. Circles, stars, jagged lines that might have been mountains or creatures from her imagination. She didn't say a word, only hummed a strange tune as her fingers moved. The sound was low, more vibration than melody, but it filled the room in a way silence never could. Kaelen noticed but said nothing. He didn't need to. The act wasn't threatening. It was innocent. Later that day, Corin built a crude figurine from scrap wire and a bent nail. He said nothing while working, hunched over a low bench in the corner, but Kaelen observed the focus in the boy's brow. The way he tightened the loop just right. The way he adjusted balance until the figure could almost stand upright. He had an engineer's eye. That caught Kaelen off guard. Still, he didn't speak. But when Corin left the figurine on the table, perhaps out of shyness or uncertainty, Kaelen didn't move it. He left it there like a small offering accepted without comment. That was how it began. No declarations, no warmth, just presence. Quiet but undeniable. Nira started talking more, to herself mostly, to the stick she carried around, to the wall, to the wind that whistled between window panes. She gave names to the noises. She turned the groans of the cabin's old frame into dialogue between invisible creatures. Selira tried to hush her sometimes, but Kaelen never did. In truth, he listened. Not to the content, half of it was nonsense, but to the rhythm, the laughter tucked into her breath, the little gasp of excitement when she discovered a loose knot in the floor and declared it a treasure spot. She brought life into the cabin the way sunlight spills through a crack. Not invited, but warm all the same. Corin was slower to thaw. He still watched Kaelen from a distance, trying to decode the man's silences, like a puzzle with missing pieces. But one evening, while Kaelen adjusted the solar inputs, Corin approached and pointed, cautiously, to a misaligned node. Kaelen glanced at it. The boy was right. He made the correction. Didn't say thank you. Didn't need to. After that, Corin began organizing things in the storage shelf, always putting items back where Kaelen had originally placed them. He never asked permission. He didn't need to. The gesture was respect, unspoken but understood. And Kaelen, for all his barriers, let it happen. He didn't invite the children in, but he didn't shut them out. That was something. One evening, Nira walked over to him with a small carved object, something Corin had made but left unfinished. She held it up without saying a word. Kaelen took it, studied it. The craftsmanship was crude, but there was care in the detail. He nodded once. Nira beamed, then ran back to her mother. He didn't smile, but the nod had meant something. By the end of the first week, the silence no longer felt like a wall. It hadn't crumbled. Kaelen still kept to himself, and Salira respected the distance. But something in the air had changed. The silence was no longer filled with suspicion or calculation. It had shape now. Wait, familiarity. They moved around each other with an ease that hadn't existed before. When Salira tended to the children's bedding or reheated rations, she no longer glanced over her shoulder as often. Kaelen no longer double-checked the water storage after she used it. The routines that had begun as rigid survival patterns were starting to blur into something else. Something that resembled coexistence. Kaelen, for his part, found it harder to remember the exact moment when he stopped noticing the children's footsteps. Their small movements, once sharp interruptions in the rhythm of the cabin, had softened into background noise. Nira's quiet chatter while playing near the wall didn't grate anymore. It filled the corners of the room in a way that almost felt lived in. And when Corin reorganized a row of utility hooks on the storage shelf, without asking, Kaelen didn't correct him. He just let it be. Salira, too, had changed in subtle ways. She no longer kept her hands folded tightly in her lap when Kaelen entered the room. She moved more freely, no longer walking on eggshells. She still didn't speak unless necessary, but the tension in her shoulders had eased, as if she no longer felt the need to brace herself for rejection. Even the air in the cabin seemed warmer. Not from the heating coils, but from breath, from presence, from bodies that no longer felt like intruders. No one declared it. No one marked the shift. But it was there. One night, after the children had fallen asleep, Kaelen sat by the power console, recalibrating the generator. The storm warnings had started again, and he wanted to be sure everything held. Salira stood nearby, refilling water canisters. Their eyes met for a brief moment, nothing more than a glance, but neither of them looked away. That was new. She didn't smile. He didn't nod. But they stayed in that shared stillness for a few extra seconds. Not awkward, not tense, just human. After that night, the line between host and guest began to dissolve even more. Kaelen no longer waited for them to finish eating before entering the main room. Salira no longer apologized when Nira knocked something over. Corin began asking quiet, technical questions about the cabin systems. Not constantly, not demanding, but curious. And Kaelen answered, briefly, without condescension. It wasn't friendship. Not yet. But it wasn't survival anymore either. It was something in between. Something they hadn't named, but all four of them were starting to feel. A rhythm. This is the end for now. The next part premieres tomorrow between 8 and 9 a.m. U.S. time. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the story, feel free to share it with your friends and loved ones.